Evan was traveling along the forgotten paths of a small village lost in the mountains. All day he walked along narrow, winding roads surrounded by dense forests until he began to feel tired. The sun was already setting, filling the sky with soft orange hues, and Evan decided it was time to find a place to spend the night. That's when he noticed it. In the distance, against the fading light, stood an old house. It was tall, but strangely narrow, as if stretched out by the weight of time. The roof was slanted, and the peeling paint on the walls spoke of years of abandonment. The house was clearly empty, or at least it should have been. However, one detail was impossible to miss. At the top of the building, on the third floor, there was a window with bright red glass. It glowed, as if a light was burning inside or some abnormal energy was reflected. Against the dull, gray facade of the house, the window looked unnatural, drawing the eye like a... Evan paused, thinking. How strange, he thought. Curiosity overcame fatigue, and he decided to go closer. The road leading to the house was covered with moss and tree roots, as if no one had used it for decades. The closer he got, the more details of the house became visible. The walls were covered with old, blackened by time boards, and a rusty metal fence ran along the perimeter. But all his attention was drawn to the red window. Inside it, as it seemed to Evan, something moved. He stopped peering. At first it could have been just a glare or a trick of the light, but after a moment he saw a shadow slowly pass behind the glass. It moved smoothly but threateningly, as if it knew that it was being watched. Evan felt a chill run down his spine. Maybe it's all just my imagination, he muttered, trying to convince himself, but his gaze remained glued to the window. The shadow stopped, and then, as it seemed to him, turned its head, directing an invisible gaze straight at him. Evan stood by the rusty gate, unable to tear his eyes away from the red window. It seemed to be pulling him towards it with invisible threads, beckoning and promising something inexplicable. His body seemed to move on its own, despite the protests of his mind. He opened the gate, which emitted a long creaking sound that broke the ringing silence of the forest. The path to the house was overgrown with moss, strewn with fallen leaves and branches. Stepping on it, Evan felt a strange tension in the air, as if the very ground under his feet was trying to warn him of something. Approaching the door, he noticed that it was ajar. A heavy wooden door covered in deep cracks was held on old, dried-out hinges. It was dark inside, the dim light of the setting sun barely making its way through the dirty windows. Evan slowly pushed the door open, and it creaked open with difficulty, making a soft, ominous sound. It was cold inside the house, despite the warm evening outside. He stood in a narrow hallway with torn wallpaper on the walls and a thick layer of dust on the floor. Every room he looked into was empty. The bare walls, the collapsed ceiling, the rotted floorboards, nothing betrayed the presence of life. However, with every step Evan took, he felt more and more pressure, as if someone invisible was watching him. He walked into a large living room. Here, among broken chairs and an overturned table, an old mirror lay in the center of the room. It was cracked, but its surface still reflected the light in an odd, distorted way. Evan looked at his reflection, and for a moment it seemed to him that it moved a little later than he did. There was a rustling sound in the hallway. Evan turned around, but there was nothing there. Just the wind, he whispered to himself, though deep down he knew there couldn't be a draft in the house. He climbed to the second floor, stepping up the stairs, the boards creaking ominously under his weight. There he found more empty rooms, but he became increasingly aware of the gaze that followed him. The impression was so clear that he turned around several times, expecting to see someone. On the third floor, right next to the red window, he entered a small room. It was empty, but the floor here was strangely clean, as if someone had recently cleaned. The red window flooded the room with a bloody light, and in this light the walls seemed to be stained with dark spots, like handprints. Suddenly, a quiet whisper was heard behind him. Evan froze. The whisper was barely audible, but the words, although indistinct, sounded insistent. He felt the cold air touch his neck, and then the room went silent. Too silent. He turned around sharply, but the room was empty. At that moment, the red window dimmed for a moment, as if something had passed on the other side. Evan took a step back, but then the floor beneath his feet creaked ominously. Evan felt the floor beneath his feet shake, and a strange silence fell around him, as if the world was holding its breath. The red light from the window became more intense, filling the room, as if calling him closer. He stepped towards the window, unable to resist. His gaze was drawn to the blood-red glass, behind which everything seemed to be seething and moving, as if there was another world on the other side of the window. Evan reached out his hand to touch the glass, and the moment his fingers touched the surface, everything around him changed. A sharp gust of wind hit him in the face, and everything spun before his eyes. The house disappeared, as did the room, and Evan felt himself falling, but instead of hitting the ground, his body suddenly stopped, as if it were suspended in midair. When he opened his eyes, he saw a world in front of him that was impossible to describe in words. It was an endless blackness, dotted with moving shadows and strange red flashes. Everything around was breathing, as if it were alive, and every whisper he had heard before now sounded from all sides. Evan tried to turn around, but found that he could not move. His body was frozen, and his gaze was fixed forward. A red glass appeared in front of him, the same window through which he had looked for so long. Now he was on the other side. Through the glass, he saw the world from which he had just come, the forest, the road, the empty house. But something had changed. Now he saw another person standing at the gate. This person, like himself before, could not take his eyes off the window. Evan tried to scream to warn the stranger, but there was no sound. Instead, he felt a new whisper coming from his essence. "Come closer," his own thoughts whispered, but the voice was alien. Evan realized that he was now part of the house, part of the window. He was no longer a man, he was an observer, a prisoner, forced to watch and call more victims into this trap. Every time someone approached the house, Evan saw their faces, their fear, and their steps toward the inevitable. He could no longer control himself, only watch as the fog pulled them toward the window, into this dark, endless world. Outside, the red window continued to glow, beckoning more travelers, and inside, in the very center of the darkness, Evan watched, called, and waited.